Okay, so this is the Bible study for Amos chapter 4. And the text says, "Hear this word, you cows of Bashan on Mount Samaria, you women who oppress the poor and crush the needy, and say to your husbands, 'Bring us some drinks.' The sovereign Lord has sworn by his holiness, the time will surely come when you will be taken away with hooks, the last of you with fish hooks. You will each go straight out through the breaches in the wall, and you will be cast out toward Harmon, declares the Lord. Go to Bethel and sin. Go to Gilgal and sin yet more. Bring your sacrifices every morning, your tithes every 3 years. Burn leavened bread as a thank offering and brag about your free will offerings. Boast about them, you Israelites, for this is what you love to do, declares the sovereign Lord. I gave you empty stomachs in every city and lack of bread in every town. Yet you have not returned to me, declares the Lord. I also withheld rain from you. When the harvest was still 3 months away, I sent rain on one town, but withheld it from another. One field had rain, another had none and dried up. People staggered from town to town for water, but did not get enough to drink. Yet you have not returned to me, declares the Lord. Many times I struck your gardens and vineyards, destroying them with blight and mildew. Locusts devoured your fig and olive trees, yet you have not returned to me, declares the Lord. I sent plagues among you, as I did to Egypt. I killed your young men with the sword, along with the captured horses. I filled your nostrils with the stench of your camps, yet you have not returned to me, declares the Lord. I overthrew some of you as I overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. You were like a burning stick snatched from the fire, yet you have not returned to me, declares the Lord. Therefore, this is what I will do, Israel. And because I will do this, Israel, prepare to meet your God. He who forms the mountains, who creates the winds, and who reveals his thoughts to mankind, who turns dawn into darkness, and treads on the heights of the earth. The Lord Almighty is his name. All right, remember that you can download a PDF copy of this Bible study at www.abqnaz.org/alive so that you can follow along with us as we study this text. Number 1 says, "To whom is Amos speaking?" in 4:1-3. Cows of Bashan. That's what it says in the first part of that verse. B, women who oppress the poor. That's what it says in the next line of that verse. C, he is talking about the rich women whose husbands are leaders of the northern kingdom in Samaria, and he is comparing them to the fattened cows of the area who are cared for beyond what is normal for animals. These women apparently are fattened as a sign of their wealth, and all of this despite others going hungry and remaining in need. So, according to the commentaries that I was reading, it does suggest that Amos is comparing the women who are the wives of the leaders of Israel to cows, to the cows who are fattened on good grass and grain. Um, and Basically saying they are also fattened on the best foods and things, while others go needy. And so, anytime in scripture, there are people that are having plenty while others are going without and starving, um, even if perhaps people don't think that they are the cause of somebody else starving. The fact that they have plenty while others go without and they don't do anything about it is something that God takes seriously and holds them accountable for. And so this is something that's definitely going on. Perhaps the policies of the government were such that the leaders were oppressing some people, but just the very fact that the leaders and their families had all this while others did not, um, And Amos, we've said Amos doesn't mince words. He's relatively plain spoken compared to other prophets, but he's also very direct, calling the wives of the leaders of Israel cows is pretty direct. And comparing them with fattened cows that are being fattened up so that they can be eaten, is kind of pretty direct too. And number 2 says, what is the judgment placed on these women and others like them according to these verses 1 through 3? A, they will be pulled through the holes in the wall. B, he is referring to their dead bodies being removed after Samaria is attacked and they die, perhaps of starvation in the siege. And C, although some translations say fish hooks, others suggest this is a hook used to move the dead bodies of cattle. So the commentary that I was reading suggested that, and yes, I've been doing some pretty deep study in the commentaries because some of this is not immediately obvious to me what it means when I read it, and so I want to try to make sure I understand and listen to some other folks that may know a little bit more than me. And the suggestion was the word that is translated fish hooks. There's like a couple of different words used, and so some people translate it fish hooks. Some suggest that this is more like, I think we've probably seen, um, if I remember right, it's like almost like a spear, but it has, the spear, and then off the side of it there's like a hook. And a dead animal can be jabbed and then pulled to be removed, or kind of drug away with this sort of implement. And the suggestion was that basically the holes in the walls that it's referring to is, the city was under siege, and it eventually was attacked by, I believe, Assyria, and a lot of stuff died. A lot of people died, um, perhaps by starvation, because that's kind of the way they did when they sieged a city. They starved them out. But these people who had been previously fat and oppressed others and didn't provide for others, are now dead, maybe from starvation, and their bodies are being dragged out to a place like you would cattle. So this is a pretty fierce and difficult prophecy, and very direct from Amos. Number 3, what is Amos saying in 4:4 through 5? A, he told them to sin. So it says, go to Bethel and sin, go to Gilgal and sin yet more. And so if you take that at face value and don't consider it rhetorical at all, then you would say, well, he just told them to go and sin. But that's probably not the correct thing. That's probably not what the prophet is actually doing. B, he told them to worship, I think. So Bethel and Gilgal are places of worship. Bring your sacrifices every morning, your tithes every 3 years, burn leavened bread as a thank offering. So these are worship practices. So was he telling them to worship? I don't think that's exactly what was going on either. Um, C, he was calling their worship sinful. So he was telling them to do, he was like, go ahead, do what you're doing. This is what I see when you're doing it. And he was saying, go ahead and bring your sacrifices, go to Bethel. But when you do it, you are sinning. So you think you're worshiping, but what you're really doing is sinning. And that's what the prophet is really saying. Their sacrifices and all the things they brought they thought were holy were marred by the fact that they were just surface and didn't match up with what was really going on inside of them and outside, away from the place of worship, probably too. They were doing they were doing it to look holy when they really weren't. They worshiped God with their lips, but their hearts were far from him. So what they're doing is they're going to worship, but he's pointing out that if their lives and their hearts and their lives are sinful, then this worship means nothing, and therefore the worship itself is a lie. The worship itself is sinful. It means nothing, and it makes a mockery of God. And that's, by the maybe I'm just kind of jumping ahead, but that's, by the way, really important, because let's consider what we're doing if we go into the house of God and we make a mockery of God by doing sort of our acts of worship when our hearts are really not even close to God, where our hearts are really not devoted to God, and when we're away from the church, we're living our lives sinfully, doing the things that we want to do, not really serving God. But then we come to church and think, oh, it's all going to be okay because I'm worshiping. Well, what Amos is saying is, no, the worship itself becomes sinful. The worship itself takes on the nature of the worshiper, and if that worshiper is not a really not a true worshiper, but rather a sinner, then the worship itself takes on the nature of that person, which is sin. So you're sinning when you come and pretend to worship, even though your heart is not a heart of worship. You live for yourself and not for God, but think that coming to worship is going to make it all better, and it doesn't work that way. That's what Amos is saying. So he's not telling them to sin, and he's not even really instructing them to worship. He's saying, okay, when you go do this, when you do what you're doing right now, this is what God sees. So number 4 says, what does God tell the people in 4:6 through 13? And really, 6 is a good microcosm of what happens in the rest of 6 through 13. What does God tell the people in 4:6 through 13? He starts out and says, I gave you empty stomachs in every city and lack of bread in every town, yet you have not returned to me, declares the Lord. We could go on and say, I've withheld rain from one field and not another. I've withheld rain from a town and not another. People were thirsty, and yet you have not returned to me. We could go through, and it's listing the things that God has done to basically withhold blessing from the people of Israel, and yet they didn't return to him. So the second part of this says, how do we feel about God giving people empty stomachs, or withholding food, or withholding rain? Um, a lot of us really don't like that concept. We don't like the thought that God would do something like that. But let's consider that if God calls us into covenant relationship with Him, and um, we don't enter into that relationship, we don't fulfill our side of the covenant, then it should not be a surprise when God does not bless, when God does not bring about the things he promised, because the covenant was, if you obey me fully, then I will be your God, and you will be my people. And so we go back to covenant. God's call is for us to come and follow him, to come and serve him, to come and live for him. And he promised that he would take care of us if we did. But we have this tendency to want to do our own thing and still get his blessing. So then when he withholds his blessing, that ought to be like a key to us, like a reminder to us, oh, shoot, I haven't been fulfilling my side of the covenant. I haven't been staying faithful to God. and I see that the result of me not being faithful to God is that he has withheld his blessings from me. And we ought to see that as sort of the right response to our unfaithfulness. But instead we're like, oh, how could God do this to us? And the answer is we did it to ourselves. We stepped out of covenant relationship with him. So then the third part of this says, do we pay attention when we go through hard times to make sure that these times are not God's way of getting our attention? And so let me just say that not all hard times mean we've been unfaithful. There have been plenty of times when I know that I have been faithful in every way that I know how, and I went through hard times. When I leaned on God in the midst of it, then he was faithful and brought me through those hard times and provided for me at every point. Um, I can't think of a time when I've really just turned away because I was mad at him because of how hard the times were, at least not in recent years. But I do think it's worthy of asking the question, is it possible that these hard times are God's blessing being pulled back because I've been unfaithful? And I always, even when I think I've been faithful, I always ask that question just because I don't want to be the one that was unfaithful, didn't realize I was being unfaithful, perhaps, or didn't like consider it, didn't think about it, ignored it, justified my unfaithfulness, and then didn't hear God's call or didn't see what he was doing. So I always go back to that and ask God when I'm going through difficult times, God, is this your blessing being removed, or is this just the difficult times that I go through in this world? I want to be faithful to you no matter what. And so I turn to him. I intensify my trust in him. And I seek after him more than ever in hard times. And if he tells me that there's something that was going on, there was some unfaithfulness in me, then I want to return to him. That's my response. If it wasn't, then drawing close to him and saying, God, I trust you now more than ever. I haven't lost my trust in you just because I'm going through a hard time, is still like, even if I never left him and it's not sort of a return situation, it's still the right response. Turning to God in difficult times is the right response no matter what. And so I sort of, but I do want to know if I've been off track so that I can, first of all, prevent it in the future, and second of all, repent, return to him. But either way, I'm drawing close to God in a hard time. And that seems to me to be the right response. Number 5 says, what seems to be the goal of all of this? So when God withdraws his blessings or withholds his blessings, it says, I did this, yet you have not returned to me. The thing that gets repeated over and over, yet you have not returned to me, declares the Lord. Yet you have not returned to me, declares the Lord. You see it in verse 6, you see it in verse 8, you see it in verse 9, you see it in verse 10, see it in verse 11. And so I think we can sort of agree that this is God's ultimate goal, that he wants his people to draw near to him. And if they've been unfaithful and they've turned away from him, he wants them to return to him. So the second part says, do you need to consider your situation and whether you need to return? And maybe if you're going through a hard time, this is something to consider in prayer. It doesn't hurt either way. If it's not because of your unfaithfulness, then it doesn't hurt to draw near to God anyway. It's the right answer either way, but it's worth consideration, because the worst thing that could happen is that God is trying to get our attention, and we have stepped away and we don't even consider that, and we don't even listen, and we don't draw near to him. So now's a good time to go to prayer. And if a return is needed, then now's the time.